On a crowded first-class flight from Boston to Chicago, Sarah Thompson, a white flight attendant with 20 years of experience, makes the biggest mistake of her career. When she sees Dr. Michelle Richardson, a young black woman in a casual Yale sweatshirt, sitting in first class, she immediately assumes there's been a ticketing error. Despite Dr. Richardson quietly showing her boarding pass, Thompson makes a scene, insisting she move to economy. What Thompson doesn't know is that this displaced passenger is not only one of the country's leading corporate attorneys, but also the daughter of the man who's about to buy the struggling airline in the next hour. As the confrontation unfolds at 30,000 feet, no one suspects that this moment of prejudice will lead to a complete transformation of the entire airline industry. Like and subscribe to follow this powerful story about how one moment of bias leads to an unexpected revolution in how we treat each other, both in the air and on the ground. Dr. Michelle Richardson had earned her first-class ticket. At 32, she'd already made partner at one of Boston's top law firms, earned 2 PhDs, and was currently finalizing the paperwork for her father's acquisition of Summit Airlines. But today she just wanted to be comfortable for her flight home, wearing her old Yale sweatshirt and leggings. "Excuse me," Sarah Thompson's voice cut through her thoughts. "I believe there's been a mistake with your seating assignment." Michelle looked up from her laptop where she'd been reviewing the airline acquisition documents. "No mistake," she said quietly, showing her boarding pass. "Seat 2A." Thompson's lips pursed. She was in her mid-50s, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, the kind of flight attendant who took pride in maintaining what she called standards. "Perhaps you misunderstood at the gate," Thompson continued louder now. "This is first class. Economy is in the rear of the aircraft." Other passengers were starting to stare. Michelle felt the familiar weight of being the only black person in first class, the burden of having to prove she belonged. "I understand where I am," Michelle replied, her voice steady despite her rising anger. "And I have every right to be here." "Listen," Thompson said, leaning closer. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know when someone's in the wrong seat. Now we can do this quietly, or I can call security." Michelle pulled out her phone, sending a quick text to her father. "Delay the signing. There's something you need to see first." "Please," Michelle said calmly, "call security. Call the captain. Call whoever you'd like. I'm not moving." Thompson straightened up, reaching for the cabin phone. "Captain, we have a situation in first class. A passenger is refusing to move to her correct section." The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated." As they waited, Michelle opened a folder on her laptop. Inside was the contract her father was about to sign, buying Summit Airlines for $3.2 billion, saving it from bankruptcy. Her finger hovered over the send button on an email to her father. Airport security boarded the plane, followed by the airline's gate manager. Thompson smiled triumphantly. "This passenger," she began, but Michelle interrupted, her voice taking on the tone she used in courtrooms. "I'm Dr. Michelle Richardson, lead counsel for Richardson Global Investments. In about..." She checked her watch. 53 minutes, my father will be completing his purchase of this airline. Unless... The gate manager's face went pale. "Dr. Richardson, William Richardson's daughter." "The same," Michelle replied. "And I've just had a fascinating experience with your airline's attitude toward diversity." Thompson's triumphant smile had frozen. The security officers were already backing away. "Now," Michelle continued, "I could move to economy as your flight attendant suggests. But then my father would need to reconsider whether Summit Airlines aligns with our company's values of inclusion and respect." The gate manager was sweating now. "Dr. Richardson, please, this is clearly a misunderstanding." "Is it?" Michelle asked. Or is it exactly the kind of systemic bias that needs to be addressed? The kind that assumes a young black woman in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class. The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated legal drama. Michelle had the gate manager bring a laptop to the plane, setting up a video call with her father and the airline's current CEO in the first-class cabin. "Daddy," she said, her voice calm but firm, "before you sign those papers, I think you should hear what just happened." William Richardson, a towering figure in business who had built his fortune by transforming struggling companies, listened intently as his daughter recounted her experience. His face darkened with each detail. Sarah Thompson stood rigid by the galley, her face ashen as she watched her 20-year career potentially crumbling before her eyes. The CEO of Summit Airlines looked equally disturbed. "Miss Thompson," William Richardson addressed the flight attendant directly through the video call. "In your 20 years of service, how many times have you questioned a white passenger's presence in first class?" Thompson stammered, I was just following protocol." "What protocol?" Michelle asked. "The one that assumes black passengers are in the wrong seat? That requires us to prove we belong even after showing valid tickets?" The CEO tried to intervene. "Mr. Richardson, I assure you this is not representative of our airline's values." "Then why," William interrupted, "does your airline have 17 discrimination complaints filed in the past year alone?" "My daughter's legal team found those during due diligence. Were you planning to mention them before I signed?" Michelle pulled up the complaints on her laptop, displaying them for everyone to see. Most of these were dismissed without investigation. All of them involved passengers of color being questioned, moved or removed from flights. The other first-class passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold, began sharing their own observations. "I fly this route every week," an elderly white businessman spoke up. "I've never once been asked to prove I belong here." "Last month," a Hispanic woman added, "I saw something similar happen to another passenger of color. I regret not speaking up then." Michelle turned back to the video call. "Daddy, I don't want you to cancel the acquisition. I want you to complete it with some changes to the terms." William Richardson smiled, recognizing the look in his daughter's eyes. It was the same look she'd had when arguing her first case, when earning her degrees, when proving to the world that she belonged in every room she entered. "What do you have in mind, sweetheart?" "First," Michelle said, "I want to lead the company's transformation, not just as legal counsel, but as CEO." The current CEO's jaw dropped. Thompson made a small choking sound. "Second, we implement immediate, comprehensive bias training for all staff, not just surface-level seminars, but real ongoing education about systemic prejudice and its impact." She looked directly at Thompson. "And third, instead of firing employees who display bias, we educate them, make them part of the solution. Starting with Ms. Thompson here, who I'd like to appoint to lead our new passenger advocacy program, after completing extensive training, of course." Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't the punishment she'd expected. "Sometimes," Michelle continued, "the best way to change a system is to transform the people within it, not just remove them." William Richardson nodded proudly. "Make it happen. The airline is yours to lead, Michelle. Show them what real inclusion looks like." News of what happened on Flight 274 spread quickly through social media. Videos taken by passengers went viral, showing both the initial discrimination and Michelle's powerful response. By the time the plane landed in Chicago, the story had already made national headlines. Michelle's first act as CEO was to invite Sarah Thompson to her new office, not for punishment, but for a conversation. "Do you know why I chose not to have you fired?" Michelle asked, gesturing for Thompson to sit. "I assumed it was for publicity," Thompson replied honestly. "Good press about forgiveness." Michelle shook her head. Number I chose to keep you because 20 years of experience is valuable if we can combine it with new understanding. Tell me, what made you so sure I didn't belong in first class? Thompson shifted uncomfortably. I guess I had an image in my mind of what first-class passengers look like. In 20 years, most of them have been white in business suits, Michelle finished. I could have worn my designer clothes, could have put on the armor I usually wear in corporate boardrooms, but why should I have to dress a certain way to be treated with respect? Tears formed in Thompson's eyes. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. I have black friends. That's exactly why I want you to lead our passenger advocacy program, Michelle interrupted. Because you represent so many people who don't recognize their own biases. Your journey of understanding can help others recognize and change their own prejudices. Over the next few weeks, Thompson underwent intensive training alongside other staff members. She learned about unconscious bias, systemic racism, and the daily experiences of people of color in spaces traditionally dominated by whites. But the most powerful lesson came from shadowing Michelle at work. She watched as the young CEO transformed the airline, implementing policies that went far beyond standard corporate diversity initiatives. Every passenger has a story, Michelle explained during a staff meeting. The grandmother flying to see her grandchildren, the student returning to college, the business owner closing a deal. Our job isn't to judge who belongs where, it's to ensure everyone travels with dignity. Thompson found herself deeply moved by the changes she observed, both in the airline and in herself. She started keeping a journal of her revelations. Day 15. Watched a young black man in a hoodie board first class today. My old self would have questioned him. Instead, I welcomed him warmly. He turned out to be a tech entrepreneur who's created hundreds of jobs. But even if he hadn't been, he had a ticket. That should have been enough. Day 23. Realized today how many times I've used following protocol as an excuse for not questioning unfair practices. Protocol doesn't equal justice. Day 30. Helped train new flight attendants today. Shared my story as a cautionary tale. The shame is still there, but now it serves a purpose, showing others how to do better. Michelle watched Thompson's transformation with satisfaction, but she knew changing one person or even one airline wasn't enough. She had bigger plans. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Summit Airlines had become a model for corporate transformation. Michelle's leadership had not only turned around the struggling airline financially, but had created a new standard for inclusive air travel. Every employee, from pilots to ground crew, underwent regular cultural competency training. But more importantly, the airline had implemented structural changes that went beyond simple training sessions. We're not just teaching people to be less biased, Michelle explained to a CNN interviewer. We're redesigning our entire system to prevent bias from affecting our passengers' experience. The changes were revolutionary. Boarding passes no longer displayed passengers' names until scanned, preventing prejudgments. Customer service representatives were assigned randomly to passengers, rather than making assumptions about who should handle which customers. Even the airline's marketing materials had been completely overhauled to reflect diverse travelers authentically. Sarah Thompson, once the face of the airline's prejudice, had become one of its most powerful advocates for change. Her passenger advocacy program had handled over 1,000 cases, turning potential conflicts into opportunities for understanding. Last week, Thompson shared during a staff meeting, we had a situation similar to what I caused with Dr. Richardson, but this time our crew was prepared. Instead of confrontation, there was conversation. Instead of assumption, there was respect. Michelle watched her former adversary with pride. Thompson's transformation was proof that change was possible, that people could grow beyond their prejudices if given the chance and the tools. But the biggest test of Summit's new approach came during a crisis. When severe weather stranded hundreds of passengers, the old Summit would have prioritized first-class customers. Instead, Michelle implemented a new system. "We don't see passengers as categories," she announced in the crowded terminal. "We see them as people. Some are traveling to weddings, others to funerals, some to job interviews, others to medical treatments. We'll prioritize based on urgent need, not ticket class." The response was overwhelming. Passengers shared their stories voluntarily. A young man gave up his seat to an elderly woman traveling to her granddaughter's graduation. A business executive offered his hotel room to a family with small children. "This," Michelle told her staff, "is what happens when we create a culture of humanity instead of hierarchy." Even competitors took notice. Other airlines began reaching out, asking about Summit's training programs and policies. Michelle saw an opportunity to expand her vision industry-wide. "We're not keeping these changes to ourselves," she announced at an industry conference. "We're making all our training materials and protocols freely available to any airline that wants them, because this isn't about competitive advantage, it's about fundamental human dignity." Sarah Thompson stood in the audience, tears in her eyes as she watched her former mistake changing not just one airline, but potentially the entire industry. Later that evening, Michelle found Thompson staring at the viral video of their first encounter, now part of the airline's training materials. "Do you regret that day?" Michelle asked gently. "Every day," Thompson replied, "and I'm grateful for it every day too. Because sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes." 1 year to the day after the incident, Michelle organized a special flight. She invited civil rights leaders, corporate executives, and everyday passengers who had experienced discrimination in air travel. But the most significant guest was a young black girl traveling alone to her first science competition. "When I was her age," Michelle told the assembled media, "I was often the only black face in first class, feeling like I had to justify my presence. Today, she boards without question, without fear, without having to prove she belongs." Sarah Thompson, now Summit's chief of passenger advocacy, was personally attending to the flight. As she helped the young girl settle into her first-class seat, she remembered her own daughter's words after watching the viral video of the incident. "Mom, how could you not see her as a person first?" The flight was more than symbolic. During the journey, Michelle announced Summit's new scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in aviation careers. The program would be named after Sarah Thompson. "Why my name?" Thompson asked, shocked. "Shouldn't it be named after you?" "Because," Michelle explained, "your story shows that change is possible, that we can grow beyond our prejudices and become champions for justice. What better message for these students?" The airline had become the industry leader, not just in diversity practices, but in customer satisfaction and profitability. Other airlines had adopted their protocols, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. As they reached cruising altitude, Michelle stood to address the passengers. "A year ago on this route, a moment of prejudice became a catalyst for change. Today, we're not just flying through the air, we're soaring beyond the boundaries of bias, proving that the sky is not the limit when we choose to see each other's humanity." She turned to Thompson. "Sarah, would you like to add something?" Thompson stood, her voice steady but emotional. "A year ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm part of the solution. And I've learned that the most powerful words we can say are not, 'I'm sorry,' but 'I understand now, and I'll do better.'" The young girl in first class raised her hand. "Ms. Thompson, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot. Will people think I can't because I'm black? Thompson knelt beside her seat. Not at Summit Airlines, sweetheart. Here, you can be anything you dream of being. We've learned that the only barriers that matter are the ones we choose to break through. As the flight descended into Chicago, Michelle looked around the cabin, at the diverse faces of passengers and crew, at Thompson helping the young aspiring pilot with her science project, at the tangible results of choosing transformation over punishment. She thought about that day a year ago, when she could have simply demanded Thompson's firing. Instead, she had chosen a harder but more meaningful path, the path of changing hearts and minds. Sometimes, she wrote in her final memo as CEO before taking on a larger role in her father's company, the greatest leadership isn't in knowing who to fire, but in knowing who to inspire. Change doesn't come from removing people who don't understand. It comes from helping them understand, from turning moments of bias into bridges of understanding. The memo, like so many things that started with that fateful flight, became part of business school curricula nationwide. But its most important reader was the young girl in first class, who would go on to become Summit's first black female pilot, proving that when we choose to see beyond our biases, the sky truly is no limit.